Hi, I'm John Serruto, and welcome to this hometown special. My guest is the outstanding award-winning sports documentary and television producer and director, Joe Lavine. And Joe, it's nice to have you at Hometown TV.
Thanks for having me. It's a
Joe,
pleasure
you
to be
you
here.
have a heck of a resume. You've got Peabody Awards and Emmys and so many outstanding accomplishments within the industry. But there had to be a path way before that. What types of things was a young Joe Lavine interested in growing up?
Wow, well, that's a good question, I guess, to start with. I can honestly say I was not a great student, but there was one course that I always liked, from elementary to junior high school to high school. I liked history. I liked hearing stories, and never did I think that somehow, someday I would make that a career. I just knew I liked stories. And went off to college and still had no idea what I wanted to be when I grew up. And it came time for junior year, and you have to declare a major. And my father had read an article in the New York Times about a course that they were giving at BU, Institute of Sport Broadcasting, something like that, where they approach sports from all different angles. And he said, well, maybe this is something you should try. So I went to BU for the summer, came back, and I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to get into sports television. I certainly enjoyed sports. I wasn't a great athlete, but I enjoyed sports. And if there was a way to make a career out of it, if I couldn't play it, maybe there's something behind the scenes I could do. And that's basically how I got to where I am today. It was through my love of sports and my love of stories and storytelling.
So you go to the University of Maryland. You study film and TV down there, Joe?
Radio, television, and film was the major when I was there. It's since now something else. But yeah, that's what I studied, and got a real up-close look at what it was like, but from a classroom perspective. And when I left, I became a messenger at New Jersey Public Television. It was my first job out of college, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way towards my education, but I learned more in the first 2 weeks of actually being in a studio and being on the set and going out on shoots and the editor letting me sit in on an edit session. I learned more in the first couple of weeks than I probably did in 4 years of college.
Okay, at a very young age though, you take a big jump and you start to work for Major League Baseball or Major League Baseball Productions. Right. How did that happen?
That's a long question that I will try to abbreviate. I was at New Jersey Public Television, and they had a cutback of the arts. And I was the last one in, so I'm the first one out. And through some family connections, we knew someone in New York who had a television production company. And I spoke to that person, and he suggested that I call Major League Baseball when there was a baseball strike going on at the time. He said, when the strike's over, call Major League Baseball, I'm sure they'll be hiring. And I did, and I called baseball the day the strike ended. I got an interview. I was very lucky, one of the few that got a job, an entry-level job, but that started the whole career when I got to Major League Baseball.
Ultimately, you start doing production work. How did you get into production work?
Well, that's what this was, Major League Baseball Productions. That's all we did. We produced This Week in Baseball and the World Series films and World Series specials, and we worked with NBC and some, I guess we did a little with ABC when they had the contract. So we were doing these shows. The great thing is that at Major League Baseball Production, just about everybody was right out of college. I'm not even sure how old the oldest person was there, but they couldn't have been in their 40s. Everybody was young, and everybody was hungry and wanted to learn and had, fresh with ideas. So within a year, I went from a viewer, which is the entry-level position where you just watch games and you chart down home run, great play, and then the producers would use those clips in the shows. I went from logging to all of a sudden I'm producing This Week in Baseball. So you got thrown into situations, and right away, I'm producing a show. So that kind of, was the beginning.
Talk a little bit for the general public, the role of a producer at that level. What would be your responsibility?
At that level, to make sure that the games were first of all coming in. Now this wasn't. There's no internet. There was no live television as far as these games were concerned. To make sure the games were coming in from the stadiums, they were all taped at every stadium, then shipped in. So you had the material to work with. And then what you would do is you would sit down. We would have 2 producers on the show. And you would sit down and you would talk about, okay, last week we did this team and this team. This week, why don't we do a couple other teams? And what are the big stories going on? What do we need to cover? This was a time where you have to remember there was no ESPN. There were no highlights on the 11 o'clock news. So this was the only place where people were actually seeing these highlights. So it was your job to formulate the weekly show, the half-hour show that ran from, opening day till through the World Series. And you were telling the story of baseball in that season.
So you basically were summarizing a week of baseball activity in a half hour.
Exactly. And we got to work with Mel Allen, obviously Hall of Fame, one of the most famous broadcasters ever. And Mel was our voice. So right away there's this credibility, and we'd go to Mel. Mel would tell us stories, and because we were so close, everyone was close in age, we were all single, we all hung out together. I mean, we were always trading ideas and what could we do different, and hey, there's a great story with a bat boy on this team. Maybe we can do a whole story on the bat boy and not the player. So it's just, these ideas would just grow from us being together.
Joe, again, you talk about your love for history and your interest in stories. And as a producer, you get a chance to create a general story, a theme for a production, don't you? That's your masterpiece. Let's talk about some of the documentaries that you've done. I know you just finished a documentary on Grantland Rice, the great sports writer from the golden era of sports back in the 20s and beyond. All right, but within that story, there are other stories. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Grantland Rice, who he was, and then really what the message was that you were trying to put out to the public?
Grantland Rice, in his day, was the most famous sports writer in the country. And when I say that, you have to remember there is no on-air people. And I'm talking about both radio and television. Grantland Rice first started writing, he graduated from Vanderbilt in 1901. So he starts writing sports in 1901 and he died in 1954, literally at the typewriter. So, I mean, there's 50 years there where Grantland Rice is the most famous sports writer in the country. What Grantland Rice did was he took a business, if you want to call it, of newspaper reporting. And when he started, there was no formal sports writing. If there was a sports article in a newspaper, it's because they needed something written, so they sent the general news guy down to the stadium to write a couple lines about it. Grantland Rice took that and he blew it up into this, this huge, and again, I hate calling it a business, but this huge opportunity for so many people after him. Grantland Rice would be able to tell stories on top of stories. He was, I think somebody in our show talks about that his articles could be, 3,000 words, 4,000 words. Well, today's USA Today article is around 300 words. So you can see what he was doing. He was introducing things into his writing that no one had ever seen or experienced before. Poetry, his over-the-top explanations of things. So it was this whole different way of reporting on sports. And I guess people liked it because he became the most famous sports writer. But the thing about Grantland Rice that I believe made him so successful was he became syndicated. So if Grantland Rice is writing an article in New York City for the New York Herald Tribune, it's being read in Omaha, it's being read in El Paso, it's being read in Spokane, it's being read all over the country. And that's when his fame and his popularity really, really grew, because everyone was reading Grantland Rice everywhere.
And Joe, again, that was a time where newspapers were really the relevancy of information.
The only place you would get information.
New York City had 14 newspapers?
Yeah, I believe they had 14, could have been more, but around 14 newspapers when he got there. Yeah, there was morning, there was afternoon, there was, midday papers. There was just so much press out there. I mean, New York loved it, and he was with the New York Herald Tribune. and did very, very well.
So if somebody had Grantland Rice's interest and Grantland was writing about them, he was writing throughout the country. That person got tremendous exposure.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We make the point in the show that it was to your advantage to be friends with Grantland Rice, because your name would be printed all over the country. A really good example of this is there was a football player named Red Grange. And, Red Grange was famous in the 20s. I don't know if people know that much about Red Grange today, but Red Grange was in the 20s. He played for Illinois. Red Grange played one game his entire career. He only played 3 years. He played one game on the East Coast. He played one game at Penn. Other than that, he wasn't all over the country. He was really good, but he was not well exposed. Grantland Rice started writing about Red Grange, and Red Grange is one of the key big names of that whole sports era that Rice made so famous.
Well, listen, you've done documentaries on many, many famous people. Of course, one of my favorites is the documentary you did on Joe DiMaggio, Joe Namath, Vince Lombardi. Have you found, as you go through researching and getting involved with these documentaries, do you personalize it with the subject? Do you find yourself getting attached to the subject emotionally?
When you spend a lot of time on a subject, I don't know how you can't. It does happen. You have to be careful and you have to stay neutral. That's the one thing I keep running through my mind, is that you're telling the story, but you want to get all sides of the story and then present that story. You can't get too friendly with someone and all of a sudden it's only nice things you're saying. If you're going to do your job and you're going to do it correctly, you're going to tell the full story of a person's life.
Both good and bad. Now, you talk about narration. We had a discussion about that previously. Oftentimes in these documentaries, there's a narrator. And oftentimes you use the subject as a narrator, as you did here really with Grantland Rice, in his own words. It was a different voice, a different person, but you're narrating his message to the public.
Well, we really felt with Grantland Rice, we wanted to do some things that were different. We felt we had to be really creative. We just couldn't do this chronological story of he was born and he died. I mean, though we tell it from beginning to end, we tell it in a different way. And one of the things we really wanted to do was not just write a script and kind of give it to you, everything in his life. So we went and we thought, wouldn't it be interesting if Grantland Rice could tell Grantland Rice's story? Let's go back and he had a biography. Obviously, he wrote for 50 years. People wrote about him. I mean, there's enough material out there that let's see if we can just piece something together. And when we started to do that, we realized Grantland Rice could tell Grantland Rice's story. So with his words, along with interviews of historians, a couple people that actually had met him, we were able to tell his story that way, and it was different than the way we normally work.
Well, in the documentary, you utilize a journalism class, and you get younger people's feedback and opinion from Northeastern University on Grantland Rice. Creative. Whose idea? What purpose?
Grantland Rice, as I said, is 1901 to 1954. Does Grantland Rice mean anything to anyone today? So I wanted to make a connection between his career and what do people think of him today. I found one of the biographers, Charles Fountain, teaches at Northeastern University. And in that class, I called him up and we had a long conversation. I said, I definitely want to, talk to you about, Grantland Rice. You wrote a book about him. I'd love to sit down and talk to you about it. But also, do you talk about Grantland Rice in your classes? And he said, I do. And I said, well, I think it would be interesting if we could, you teach the class and let me hear what the kids have to say about Grantland Rice and what they make of him today, looking back on his career. So that's kind of how it came about. I contacted him and he said, by all means, come to Boston, shoot our class, and we'll have a discussion on Grantland Rice. And it's interesting in the show, I think that they really nail who Grantland Rice was, what he was trying to do, what he accomplished, what he meant to people, and I think it worked for what we were trying to do with it.
Joe, when you do a production, and again, let's stay with Grantland Rice for now. You have a reporter, which is Grantland Rice, with a typewriter and a desk. And you show different eras throughout his lifetime. Again, putting these documentaries together, is it a team of people? Do you come up with that idea? Is it a consortium of thought that says, let's keep Grantland visible as we move through the era of time?
I can honestly say there's no show I've worked on where it's been just myself. I mean, it is a team of people, and I've been very lucky to work with some really good people who I continue to work with, you know, whether it be an editor, a writer, an associate producer. I mean, everyone has their role, and when everyone gets together, the ideas, you know, they just flow, and we can talk things back and forth. I remember walking into our very first meeting, I said, I don't know if we can do this with Grantland Rice telling his own story. I don't know if there's enough stuff. And I was working with a woman who writes the shows I work on. She goes, well, let's see if there's enough stuff out there. And my editor was in the meeting. He goes, of course, that's definitely what we're going to do here. We're going to let Grantland Rice tell our story. So each idea builds on the next idea. So yeah, it is a number of voices that put these things together.
Fascinating watching the Namath documentary, and he takes a very large role in that documentary, you know, answering questions. Really, you don't see the person asking the questions, of course, but he sits there and basically narrates his position. Did you have an open canvas when you did Joe Namath?
Yeah, we did. We met with Joe a couple of times. I remember the first time I did that show with a producer from NFL Films. That was a joint production between HBO and NFL Films. So the NFL Films producer, who then we went on and worked together on Lombardi together, but I'm sorry, the reverse. We first did Lombardi, then we went back and did Namath. At HBO, we always wanted to do Namath, but he was never really ready to tell his story, I guess. I don't know. But he kept saying no, and finally he said yes. So then the producer from NFL Films and myself flew down to Florida, and we had lunch with Joe. And we sort of told him what we wanted to do. And he just listened. He just listened to everything we had to say. And the next thing we knew, he said, okay, you know, when do you guys want to start? The show was shot over a number of months. The interview you see of Joe Namath in the show, it was actually 3 different interviews, like 4-hour sessions each time. There was a lot of interviewing we did with him. So we were with him quite a bit. And he did, I guess at the end of the day, trust us enough to open up and you know, tell us his story. And it was exactly what we wanted. We wanted it from him.
Well, it was a tremendous piece, an award-winning piece, in fact. You know, and speaking of awards, now listen, 7 Emmys, 2 Peabodys, top of the industry, tremendous work. But, you know, like an actor, oftentimes actors really can't appreciate their work. Do you find yourself capable of appreciating your good work, or are you still critical?
I'm worried about the next one.
Worried about the next one? You're moving on already.
Yeah, there's always a next show.
Yeah.
You know, you hear athletes say that kind of stuff all the time. You know, do you appreciate the World Series wins or your perfect game? And they, you know, have their answer. And I think you need time and space. I mean, I look back at some of the shows, and there's certain things that I'm very proud of in those shows. But I don't dwell on them, you know, because really there is another one you're working on, and you got to get busy on that.
All right. So some of the elements that need to come together to put out a good documentary. You talked about the story. You talked about narration. How about some of the things that are very difficult to get, whether it's old video, taking stills, bringing them to life, the importance of sound and music?
All those things are very important. The Grantland Rice show is a perfect example of trying to be creative in telling a story that isn't that easy to tell, because you know, Grantland Rice didn't do that much on camera work. We have a little bit in there, but he wasn't an on-camera person per se. So it's how do you come up with elements to tell your story? And footage is obviously hugely important. I mean, it's a visual medium, so that's what you're doing. So, you know, to have someone to work with that's good at that knows where to go digging for this footage. There are pockets everywhere of these footage houses. Some specialize in certain things, others other things. Well, to work with someone who's really knowledgeable of that whole field is invaluable when you put these shows together. So with Grantland Rice, it was finding where are all these photos. Okay, we have all these photos. You can't just show photo after photo. That'll get boring after a while. Well, someone could say, well, maybe we can, and lots of people have done this. I didn't rediscover the wheel here, but maybe we can do it in a classy, creative way, and we have a book of his memories or something, and we go through it, a scrapbook kind of thing. So you find different ways to do this that keeps it interesting and entertaining. We had cartoons. We had several cartoons in this. There were some interesting Grantland Rice stories that I knew we weren't going to find visuals to match it. But how about if we have someone come in and actually make a cartoon? If we have a little cartoon character of Grantland Rice and he's meeting Babe Ruth for the first time. I mean, that's kind of funny, but yet we're telling the story. The message is getting through. So you're just always trying to look for different ways to keep your audience. The clicker's never far away from anyone, and you want to be entertaining, yet you want to teach someone something too.
Well, I've noticed in many of your documentaries, I'll see newspaper clippings and articles, and we'll see that for 15 seconds, yet it holds the viewer. There's interest to it because you have so many other things going on around it.
Right. And you mentioned something before. Music is hugely important. Audio is important. It's all the little things that you might just play in the background, but they are in some way subconsciously taking you along the route. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of elements that go into the production of the shows.
All right, Joe Lavine. So you've got a lot of years in, you have a lot of years left. Obviously, somebody had to influence you. Who were the biggest influences for you in your career and in your life?
Influences. Well, I mean, I could give you the standard answer, which in my case happens to be true. My parents were very hardworking, both worked all the way, so the work ethic came there. My dad, who found the article in the New York Times that there was a course up at BU, that got me going on my career. I guess people that I've worked with through the years, people that have taught me how to tell stories. You try to pick and choose as you go along, little bits from everywhere you've been, and that becomes you. You put all those together, and that becomes, I guess, my style. So that's I don't know. There's so many people that have been involved.
Other works that you've seen that have really impacted you or moved you. Any other documentaries that you've enjoyed that somebody else has done?
It's a good question. I'm really proud of the HBO documentaries that we did while I was there. There were several that were really top-notch that, everything from they did an Ohio State, Michigan. I grew up an Ohio State fan, so to see this whole Woody Hayes, Bo Schembechler documentary, that was interesting to me. There was a whole series of When It Was a Game, where the documentaries told the stories of baseball through the baseball players from the 40s, the 50s, the 30s, with color footage. That was terrific. So Connors Borg McEnroe. I could go on and on with the documentaries there. And the 30 for 30s are, they're great.
What makes those 30 for 30s so great? Because no matter who seems to be putting them out, whether ESPN's just not accepting anything short of great work, but what is it that just has the public so excited and riveted to the 30 for 30s?
I think there's a couple different things. First of all, they very talented people working on it, very talented. They tell great stories. A lot of them are contemporary, so a lot of people can sit around and say, oh yeah, I remember watching that game. They're able to think back to when they saw Christian Laettner or some other story that they saw that's now being portrayed in a documentary. They've done an incredible job in marketing the 30 for 30 name. When they came out the first year, I'm not sure that they can. It was done for 30, I believe it's 30 films showing the 30 years that ESPN was on the air. And I don't know, I wasn't there, but I don't know that they had plans to make this, we're going to go on, we're just going to keep going on. But they found that 30 for 30 name became so successful that now when you read in the paper, there's a new 30 for 30 coming on, you go, oh, okay, what is this one? Oh, I have to see this one. So I think they've just done a great job in marketing it.
They certainly have, and similar to what HBO's done with their documentary films, that are a little bit longer than the 30 for 30s, but HBO offered a lot of opportunities to a young person like Joe Lavine when our normal set 6, 7 stations expanded to cable, and then of course HBO was created. What did that do for the industry, Joe?
Well, I think HBO with their documentaries, they were not the first to do sports documentaries. You had a guy like Bud Greenspan who was doing those Olympic documentaries for years. There were other documentaries that have been done in the past, but I think HBO took it, and not that they made a series out of it and they started to deliver them on a regular basis, but they allowed us as filmmakers, and I was very lucky to get in there at the time to work on projects. They certainly gave us the budget to work on projects, and then they took it so seriously. I mean, we went over every frame with a fine-tooth comb. They would only put it on the air after everyone was happy with it, that the stories were well told, that the footage represented what you're talking about in the show, that we have a voice that's compelling. It became Liev Schreiber.
Fantastic.
So there were a lot of elements that I think made the HBO documentaries what they went on to be, and the reputation that they still have.
Joe, this first segment went way too fast. I have one last question in it, and if we can keep our answers short. We talk about evolution, just like you showed in Grantland Rice's piece, that evolution came to the point where Grantland kind of aged out a bit. When television changed, when you and I were growing up, we only had 5, 6, 7 stations. Then cable came on. Cable changed what you do today. It changed a whole industry and gave people all sorts of opportunities. Can you expand on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you said it pretty well, that there's now not 5 channels, there's 100 channels, or whatever your station, your cable system has. And with the new with all those new stations, all those new shows, they need programming. I mean, there's no question. And now you take it to the next level, and now you have streaming. So it went from the 5 stations to cable to now we have the Netflixes and the Hulus and the Amazons. So there's even more opportunities out there. But still, it has to be a good story. You're not just going to put anything on these. These places won't just run anything. You have to come up with a good story, and you have to tell it well.
Well, why don't we do this, Joe Lavine? We get together again, and we'll talk about the opportunities for young people in this industry. We'll talk about stories again. We'll talk about putting together those good stories and many other things about your career as we move forward.
Great.
So thank you for joining me on part 1
Thank you.
of Joe Lavine, and thank you so much for joining this Hometown Special.